The mining moon was quiet that evening, covered in silver dust that shimmered faintly under the twin suns. The human outpost stood on the edge of a rocky ridge, surrounded by strange whispering winds that carried the sounds of distant machinery. Inside the station, the engineer worked late, checking power lines and cleaning the filters on the generators. She was used to the silence, used to the loneliness that came from working far away from Earth. But that night, something was different. She heard a sound, soft, shaky, almost like a whimper, coming from behind one of the cargo lifts. At first, she thought it was a malfunction, maybe a loose pipe or a damaged vent. But when she looked closer, her heart skipped a beat. There, crouched between the metal crates, was a small creature, trembling, eyes wide, its thin chest rising and falling too fast. It wasn't human. Its scales were a dull gray, its body small but strong, and its hands, clawed but delicate, clutched a broken piece of armor. A faint glow pulsed under its skin, a sign of its alien species. She recognized it immediately from the reports, a Karath cub. The Karath were known across the sector as fierce hunters, intelligent, territorial, and hostile toward humans. Even their young were said to be dangerous. The commander had made it clear. If you ever see one, report it. They attack on instinct. But as the engineer knelt quietly, she saw something the reports never mentioned. The cub wasn't growling or hissing. It was shivering, wounded, and scared. Its left leg was twisted, and a faint trail of blue blood stained the floor beneath it. She froze, unsure what to do. The logical choice was to call security, but something inside her stopped her hand from reaching for the radio. The creature looked at her, its glowing eyes full of pain, and clutched the broken armor closer to its chest like a child holding onto a toy. It wasn't dangerous, not now. It was just trying to survive. The loud voice of the base commander broke through the communicator in her ear. "What's taking so long? I see movement on the monitors." She hesitated, then answered, "Just a loose panel, sir. I'll handle it." She turned off the link before he could ask more questions. Slowly, she crouched down, keeping her hands open so the cub wouldn't see her as a threat. "Hey," she said softly, though she knew it wouldn't understand her words. "You're hurt." The cub made a low, frightened sound, half hiss, half whimper, but didn't move. The armor piece it held seemed far too heavy for its small frame, yet it refused to let go. She wondered if it had belonged to its parent, maybe a fallen warrior. Her chest tightened at the thought. For a moment, she saw not a creature, but a child that had lost everything. The commander's voice came again, sharp and impatient. "Report now! If it's a Karath, get rid of it!" She looked down at the cub whose tiny body trembled under the flickering light. Fear told her to listen, to back away, to seal the hatch and pretend she'd never seen it. But her heart wouldn't let her. "I can't," she whispered to herself. Taking off her jacket, she moved closer, speaking softly the way she might to calm a scared animal. The cub's breathing slowed, its eyes darting between her and the exit. Then, without warning, it lowered its head and let her cover it gently with the jacket. For a moment, time stood still. A human and a predator, both alone, both uncertain, sharing the same quiet space. The engineer didn't know why she helped it, only that something deep inside told her it was right. As she lifted the small, trembling creature into her arms, she felt its heartbeat, fast, desperate, alive. She glanced toward the window, where the moons glowed pale and distant, and whispered, "You're safe now." Neither of them knew it yet, but that simple act of kindness would change everything. For her, for the cub, and for the world that had always feared the unknown. The next day passed in its usual rhythm, long hours, the hum of machines, and the faint crackle of radio chatter across the outpost. The engineer worked quietly, her thoughts drifting back to the small creature she had helped the night before. She hadn't told anyone what she'd done. The cub was gone when she returned to the site that morning, and for a moment she thought it hadn't survived. But deep down, she hoped it was still out there somewhere among the ridges. By evening, fatigue began to set in. Her muscles ached from the heat and the heavy gear, and when the sun dipped below the silver dunes, she made her way to the hangar to rest. The metallic smell of fuel mixed with the soft hum of the air filters filled the air. She removed her helmet, setting it on a crate beside her, and sat down with a long sigh, rubbing her temples. She barely noticed the faint sound of claws tapping against the floor behind her. At first, she thought it was one of the base drones moving through the shadows. But then she saw it. A small shape slipping through the side door, its movements careful but quick. The cub. It looked cleaner now, its scales faintly glistening under the hangar lights, though one of its legs still carried a limp. She froze, unsure if she should move. The creature stopped, looked at her, then turned its gaze toward her helmet. For a long second, it just stared at it, as if drawn by something familiar. Then in a sudden burst of movement, it darted forward, grabbed the helmet by the chin strap, and began dragging it toward the exit. The helmet was almost as big as the cub itself, clanking loudly as it scraped the floor. She couldn't help but let out a quiet laugh. The sight was ridiculous and oddly touching at the same time. Before she could react, the security alarm beeped softly, detecting unauthorized movement near the equipment bay. Within seconds, the intercom crackled to life. "Security breach detected in Hangar 3. The noise startled the cub, and it vanished through the open doorway, dragging the helmet along. A few crew members rushed in, laughing when they realized what had happened. "Guess your little friend's a thief now," one of them joked. Hours later, after the alarms were reset and the laughter faded, she followed the faint trail of footprints out into the dark. The twin moons lit the rocky path as she climbed a small ridge overlooking the station. There, in a shallow hollow, she found the cub curled up. It wasn't chewing on the helmet or breaking it, it was wearing it. The large, shiny object rested over its small head like armor, the visor tilted awkwardly but covering its face. It looked almost proud, yet comforted, hiding inside it like a frightened child behind a blanket. For a long moment, she just watched. The wind rustled through the sand and the stars shimmered above them. When she stepped closer, the cub looked up, blinking slowly from inside the helmet's visor. She could see her reflection in its faint golden glow. Instead of fear, she felt warmth, something deep and unexplainable. The creature wasn't stealing. It was holding on to the one thing that reminded it of safety. Of her. Slowly, she knelt and whispered, "You can keep it." The cub tilted its head, then lowered it again as if understanding. As she walked back to the outpost, the night felt different, softer somehow. The cub had taken her helmet, but in a strange way it had given her something back, a reminder that even in a universe full of danger, trust could start in the smallest, most unexpected ways. That night, after the base lights dimmed and the quiet hum of the generators filled the air, she couldn't stop thinking about the little creature hidden in the ridge. Everyone else was asleep or too busy to care, but she couldn't forget those golden eyes peering out from under her helmet. Something about that look stayed with her. Not the fear, but the way it seemed to search for something. So she packed a small meal from the storage room, a few protein rations, a container of water, and slipped out through the maintenance hatch, her steps light against the cold metal floor. The air outside was still, the moons hanging low over the barren horizon, painting the ground in silver light. She followed the same path she'd taken earlier, up the ridge where the cub had vanished. When she reached the hollow, she stopped a few meters away and knelt down, setting the food on a flat rock. "It's just me," she said softly, even though she knew it couldn't understand. For a while there was nothing, only the faint whisper of wind through the rocks. Then she saw it. Two glowing eyes, faint but unmistakable, watching her from the shadows. The cub didn't move closer, didn't growl. It just stayed there, hidden beneath the oversized helmet, its small chest rising and falling quickly. She could see the reflection of the moonlight on the metal, her own face faintly mirrored back at her. Carefully, she pushed the food closer and backed away. Minutes passed before the cub moved. It crawled forward slowly, cautious but curious, sniffing at the air. Then, with a hesitant motion, it reached the rations and began to eat. Not greedily, but with small, careful bites. She smiled to herself and whispered, "Good." It didn't react, but something in her heart felt lighter. When it finished, it dragged the helmet back over its head, almost like a ritual of safety, and vanished again into the dark. She returned the next night. and the next. Each time, she brought food and water, sitting a little closer but never reaching out. The cub began to wait for her, its glowing eyes appearing sooner, its body less tense. Sometimes, when she arrived, it would already be sitting by the rock. The helmet tilted slightly, almost as if it had been watching the path she always came from. It was still cautious, but no longer afraid. She found herself talking to it quietly. About her day, about the strange silence of the moon, about how lonely the outpost could feel. She never expected a response, but somehow the quiet moments they shared felt like a kind of conversation. One night, as she was about to leave, she noticed something different. The cub had dragged the helmet closer to her side of the ridge, stopping just a few steps from where she sat. It wasn't much, just a small gesture, but it felt like trust. She smiled softly, whispering, "You're learning, aren't you?" The cub blinked slowly, its eyes warm under the glow of the moons. As she walked back to the base, she realized it wasn't pity she felt anymore. It was connection. Two beings from different worlds, both stranded in their own way, had found a quiet understanding, one that didn't need words, only presence. And in the cold emptiness of that distant moon, that was enough. The night began like any other on the mining moon, quiet, calm, and filled with the low hum of machinery working beneath the dust-covered ground. The engineer sat inside the control room, scanning the system reports, sipping a lukewarm cup of water as the rest of the crew prepared to turn in. The screens around her flickered with faint light, showing the outpost's perimeter, equipment logs, and life readings from the nearby terrain. Everything seemed normal until one small red dot began blinking at the edge of the radar. At first, she thought it was a glitch, maybe interference from a sandstorm forming beyond the ridge. But then more dots appeared, 3, then 6, then 9, all moving fast, closing in on the outpost from the north. Her pulse quickened. She leaned closer to the monitor, fingers flying across the controls to zoom in. It wasn't a storm. It was movement, human-sized, armed, raiders. Within seconds, the alert siren blared across the base. Red lights flashed, cutting through the quiet like a blade. "All personnel to stations!" The commander's voice thundered through the comms. The crew scrambled into motion, rushing down the halls, grabbing weapons, locking doors. She stood quickly, heart pounding. Raiders were scavengers, ruthless people who hunted the edges of colonized worlds, stealing supplies, destroying what they couldn't take. Their attacks were quick and brutal, and they never left witnesses. She raced to the energy core chamber, the heart of the base. If they reached it, everything, the power, the communications, even the life support, would be gone. Her hands shook slightly as she entered the override codes to seal the power room. The metal doors groaned shut, locking into place with a heavy clang. Then she turned to check the security feed. Multiple screens flickered with static and grainy images of the surrounding desert. She scanned through each camera. Empty hills, shifting dust, shadows moving between the rocks. But then something made her stop. On one of the feeds, near the ridge she had visited so many times, a small shape stood motionless against the silver sand. Her breath caught. She knew that shape. The sloped head, the long tail, the faint shimmer of scales catching moonlight. The cub, it wasn't hiding this time. It was standing tall on the ridge, watching the valley below where the raiders' heat signatures glowed faintly on her scanner. The wind blew around it, lifting small waves of dust, but it didn't move. And there, faint but clear under the light of the moons, she saw it, the helmet. Her helmet, the same one it had stolen, still resting on its head, glowing softly from the tiny blue power light on the side. For a long moment, she couldn't look away. The cub's stance was steady, alert, not scared, but focused. It looked almost like a guard. The commander's voice crackled again over the speakers. "Scanners confirm hostile movement. Prepare to engage!" But she wasn't listening anymore. Her eyes stayed on the feed, where the small creature still stood. The camera's night filter showed faint heat signatures, the raiders moving closer, and yet the cub didn't run. It turned its head toward the base, toward her, and for a brief second, she could swear it was looking straight into the camera. Her throat tightened. "You shouldn't be out there," she whispered to the screen, as if it could hear her. Outside, the first distant echo of gunfire broke the night. The lights flickered once. She backed away from the monitor, torn between duty and fear. Somewhere in the chaos, alarms blaring and orders shouting through comms, a thought struck her. Maybe it wasn't just guarding its hiding place. Maybe it was guarding her. The screen flickered again, showing one last glimpse before cutting to static. The Cub, still standing on the ridge, the faint glow of the helmet shining through the darkness like a tiny beacon of courage. The engineer took a deep breath, her heart pounding, and whispered into the silence, "Hold on." She didn't know if she meant it for the base, for herself, or for the little creature that had somehow become her silent protector. But deep inside, she knew. Everything was about to change. The attack began without warning. One moment, the valley was quiet beneath the pale moons, and the next, the sky erupted in fire. Explosions rolled across the rocky horizon, shaking the outpost walls. The first blast knocked out half the lights, sending sparks raining down from the ceiling. Alarms screamed through the corridors as the crew scrambled to respond, shouting orders over the comms. The engineer ran toward the hangar, the sound of her boots echoing against the metal floors. The air was thick with dust and smoke, stinging her eyes as she tried to reach the power grid controls. But before she could get there, another explosion thundered outside, blowing the side door open and throwing her to the ground. She coughed, blinking through the haze. The air smelled of burning fuel. Outside, flashes of light tore through the night, gunfire from the raiders. Their dark shapes moved quickly, almost ghost-like, slipping between shadows and debris. She ducked behind a stack of crates, her heart hammering. The sound of footsteps drew closer, heavy, fast, confident. A scavenger stepped into view, his weapon raised. The blue glow from his visor cut through the smoke, fixing on her position. She froze, pressing her back against the wall. She knew she wouldn't reach her sidearm in time. Her breath caught as the man raised his weapon. But then something else moved, fast and low from the ridge. A sharp, echoing roar sliced through the chaos, so loud and wild it didn't sound like anything human. The scavenger spun around, startled, his light flashing across the sand. Out of the darkness came a blur of motion, a creature leaping from the shadows with terrifying speed. It crashed into him, knocking him to the ground with a metallic clang. The engineer's eyes widened in disbelief. It was the Cub, but not the small, trembling thing she had once found hiding under a crate. It was bigger now, stronger, its muscles coiled like steel, its scales darker and glinting under the burning light of the explosions. The creature let out another roar, the sound vibrating through the ground. The raider struggled, but the Cub was faster, its claws flashing as it drove him back. Two more raiders ran toward the commotion, weapons raised, but the Cub turned with lightning speed, shielding the engineer behind its body. She could see the faint, cracked helmet still on its head, the small light on the side flickering weakly as it moved. It wasn't running, and it was protecting her. For a few moments, time blurred. The sounds of gunfire, shouts, and explosions mixed with the growl of the creature defending her. Every instinct told her to hide, to escape, but she couldn't move. She just stared, caught between fear and awe. The base defenders finally arrived, their rifles blazing, pushing the raiders back toward the valley. "Fall back!" someone shouted over the intercom. The scavengers retreated into the darkness, leaving smoke and broken metal in their wake. When the last echo faded, the engineer pushed herself to her feet, her ears ringing. The hangar was in ruins, walls scorched, crates overturned. In the center of it all, the Cub lay still, its body half covered in dust and ash. The cracked helmet rested beside it, faintly glowing, a single light still blinking weakly. She ran forward and knelt beside it, gently brushing away the debris. Its breathing was shallow, its chest rising and falling in short, painful bursts. No, stay with me," she whispered, her voice shaking. The Cub blinked slowly, lifting its head just enough to look at her. Even in pain, its eyes were calm, not wild, not afraid, just peaceful. Around them, soldiers were shouting orders, securing the perimeter, but all she could hear was the soft rasp of its breathing. Carefully, she placed a hand against its scales. "You saved me," she said softly. The Cub made a faint rumbling sound, its version of a purr. before its eyes closed again. The commander rushed in, scanning the damage, but when he saw her kneeling beside the creature, he stopped. No one spoke. The air felt heavy, like something sacred had happened. The battle was over, the base still standing, but it was clear to everyone who had truly guarded them that night. When the smoke finally cleared, the image remained, a wounded predator lying beside a cracked human helmet, both symbols of courage, both bound by a bond stronger than fear. The night after the battle was heavy with silence. Smoke still curled through the broken air vents, and the acrid scent of burned fuel hung thick around the base. The engineer's hands shook as she knelt beside the wounded creature, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. The cub lay half buried in the dust, its body marked with deep gashes and burns from the explosion. Its breathing was ragged, uneven, and its claws twitched weakly with each exhale. When she reached out to touch it, it gave a faint snarl. Not a threat, but a reflex, born of pain and exhaustion. She didn't pull away. Gently, she rested her hand on its side, whispering, "It's over. You're safe now." The cub's growl faded, replaced by a shaky, trembling breath. Around her, soldiers had gathered in stunned silence. None of them moved closer. Some whispered in disbelief, others just stared. A predator, a Kareth, had defended a human? It didn't make sense. These creatures were known as killers, untamable and wild, and yet here it was, lying still beside her, its head resting inches from the cracked helmet it had once stolen. "Leave it," the commander ordered, his voice rough. "It's dangerous. We'll deal with it later." But she shook her head, her voice calm but firm. "No, it saved us. I'm not leaving it to die." Before anyone could stop her, she slipped her arms under the creature's limp body. It was heavier than she expected, its scales rough and warm, but she lifted it anyway, staggering slightly as she rose. The commander started to protest, but one look at her face silenced him. Step by step, she carried the cub through the wrecked corridor, past broken lights and scattered debris, until she reached the med bay. The room was quiet, the lights dimmed, the air thick with antiseptic. She placed the cub gently on a wide diagnostic bed, ignoring the blood smudges staining her sleeves. The medical droid's sensors beeped in confusion, unable to classify the creature's biology. "Override protocol," she said quickly. "Just stabilize it." The machine obeyed, scanning the cub and applying low-level regenerative gel over its wounds. She stayed beside it the entire night. When exhaustion pulled at her, she refused to leave, propping herself against the wall and watching the slow rise and fall of its chest. Every few hours it stirred, growling softly, its body tensing. But when she spoke to it, her voice low and steady, it calmed again. By morning, the other soldiers peeked in, their expressions a mix of shock and curiosity. "She's still with it," one whispered. "It should be dead by now." But it wasn't. It was fighting, and so was she. Days passed. The base began to rebuild, patching holes, restoring power, and counting losses. But inside the med bay, something extraordinary was happening. The cub grew stronger. The burns began to fade, replaced by new, shimmering scales that caught the light like tiny mirrors. It ate the food she brought and drank from her hand, watching her every movement. Once, when she left for a few hours to repair the generator, she returned to find it awake, sitting upright, its eyes fixed on the door, waiting for her. When she entered, it made a low, soft rumble that almost sounded like relief. By the end of the week, the cub could walk again. When she opened the med bay door to test its reaction, it didn't run away. Instead, it followed her down the corridor, step for step, its gaze alert and protective. Soldiers stepped aside as they passed, whispering to each other. The sight was almost unreal. A human and a creature that once symbolized danger walking together like companions. At first, she thought it was only following her out of instinct, but soon she realized it was something more. When others approached her too quickly, the cub would move between them, its head low, its golden eyes cautious. It wasn't guarding itself anymore. It was guarding her. Everywhere she went, it went too. To the hangar, to the repair stations, even to the ridge at night where they had first met. The once feared predator had become her shadow, her silent protector. And every time she looked at it, she saw not a monster, but a miracle. proof that sometimes the most dangerous things in the universe only needed one act of kindness to change forever. It didn't take long for the story to spread. Word of what had happened on the mining moon, of a predator saving a human, traveled faster than any official report. At first, people dismissed it as a rumor, a wild tale born out of chaos. But when photos surfaced of the engineer walking side by side with the young Kareth cub through the repaired hangar, everything changed. The image was too real, too moving, a human and a creature once feared as enemies walking together like old friends. News channels across the colony picked up the story, calling it the miracle on Outpost 9. Scientists, diplomats, and journalists flooded the area, all wanting to see it for themselves. Within a few days, the base transformed from a quiet industrial station into a place of wonder. Researchers from both species came to observe the bond between the human and the cub. The Kareth, who rarely interacted with humans outside of tense negotiations, sent their representatives to witness it firsthand. When the Kareth transport ship landed, the air grew heavy with curiosity and caution. From it emerged 3 elders, tall and regal, their scales marked with silver streaks of age and wisdom. The human soldiers stepped back instinctively, their hands hovering near their weapons, but the engineer raised her hand to stop them. "It's all right," she said quietly. The cub, now healthy and proud, stood beside her, watching the elders approach with glowing eyes. The oldest Kareth elder studied the scene in silence before speaking in a low, resonant tone. His translator device crackled softly as his words became clear. "This cub carries a debt of spirit." The crowd murmured, unsure of what that meant. The elder continued, "It has shared its strength with one who showed it mercy. The bond between them is sacred." He turned his gaze toward the engineer, his expression unreadable but filled with respect. "You are now one who shares courage." He extended a clawed hand, drawing a symbol in the air, a spiral of light that shimmered briefly before fading. Her wrist tingled, and when she looked down, she saw a faint mark glowing against her skin. The mark of the Kareth, a symbol of honor few outsiders had ever received. The soldiers watched in stunned silence, and even the commander lowered his head in quiet respect. For the first time, humans and Kareth stood side by side, not as enemies or competitors, but as witnesses to something greater, trust born from fear and friendship born from compassion. Scientists recorded everything, eager to study what they called cross-species emotional bonding, but to her it wasn't something to be studied. It was something to be felt. As the days passed, the talks between the two species began. What started as an inspection turned into conversation and then cooperation. The Kareth elders spoke of future partnerships, trade, and shared protection of the moon's resources. Humanity, long afraid of the predator's strength, began to see them as allies instead of monsters. And it had all started because one woman had chosen kindness over fear, and one cub had returned it tenfold. Standing under the pale light of the moons, the engineer looked at the cub beside her. It glanced up, the faint glow of her cracked helmet still reflecting in its eyes. She smiled and whispered, "Looks like they finally understand you." The cub let out a low, contented rumble, its version of a smile, as the stars above witnessed the beginning of a peace that had taken decades to find. Months passed, and life on the mining moon slowly returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after what had happened. The outpost had been rebuilt stronger than before, its steel walls gleaming under the pale twin suns. Trade routes reopened, scientists came and went, and construction drones buzzed through the sky. But amid all that progress, one thing stood out, a sight that still made everyone stop and stare, a human and a predator walking side by side. The cub that once fit in the crook of her arm was no longer small. It had grown tall and powerful, its dark scales now gleaming with shades of silver and bronze. Its glowing eyes held not wildness anymore, but intelligence, calm, alert, loyal. Wherever she went, it followed. They were no longer seen as an oddity. They had become a symbol, living proof that even between the most unlikely of beings, trust could grow stronger than fear. At the edge of the base, near the same ridge where they had first met, the engineer stood with the now-grown Kareth beside her. The wind swept across the valley, carrying the soft hum of distant machines. The sky above was painted with violet and gold as night began to fall. The cub, though calling it a cub now felt wrong, still carried something familiar on its back, her old, battle-scarred helmet. It had been repaired and reinforced, but its surface was marked with new engravings, symbols of both species intertwined, drawn by Kareth elders and human artisans together. The helmet, once a tool of protection, had become something far more meaningful, a sign of unity. She smiled as she looked at it, memories flashing through her mind. The first time she saw the frightened creature hiding beneath that same helmet. The night it had saved her life, the long days in the medbay when she refused to leave its side. "You've come a long way," she said softly, her voice carrying in the quiet wind. The creature turned its head toward her, its glowing eyes gentle. It let out a deep, low rumble that vibrated through the air, its version of a purr. The sound made her laugh under her breath. She reached out and rested a hand on its shoulder. "Keep it," she said, nodding toward the helmet. "You earned it." The Kareth lowered its head slightly, a gesture of understanding, and let out a slow exhale, a warm breath that rippled through the cool air. They stood there together, human and alien, watching as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky. In that moment, there was no fear, no boundary, no war, only a shared silence between two beings who had defied everything their worlds believed. In the months that followed, the story spread far beyond the moon. Colonies told it as a lesson for children, a tale of courage and compassion. The Kareth called it the Bond of Spirit, while humans named it the Guardian of Outpost 9. Statues were built, one of a woman and a Kareth standing side by side, both looking toward the horizon. Scholars studied the event for years, but no scientific report could ever capture what it truly meant. It wasn't just about survival or instinct. It was about something deeper: empathy. Decades later, long after the engineer retired and the Kareth returned to its homeworld, the story lived on. Explorers still carried it with them when they met new species across the stars, repeating the same message over and over, that empathy could cross any boundary, that understanding could disarm even the fiercest heart. And every now and then, on a quiet night, when the moons were bright and the wind was still, some said they could see two silhouettes standing on that same ridge, one human, one Kareth, side by side watching the stars in eternal peace.